Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Beyond Training podcast. I'm your host, Liam Dalton. Today, we're joined by a phenomenal guest, Mr. Robert Whitaker. Really looking forward to this episode. Of course, this man's work speaks for itself, and so there's no need for me to offer too much praise here or even recap it. He's definitely well known in the field of psychology, and um, I'm really grateful to have him on today. So, Mr. Whitaker, thank you so much for coming on today.
It's a pleasure being here. Thanks for inviting me.
Certainly. Yeah. So I always ask an introductory question that gives us a nice little baseline. I ask my guests to define health. I want to know how question, but I'd like
Define health.
your
Well,
perspective.
that's a question. Well, I didn't even ever thought of trying to define health. Well, listen, obviously health encompasses there's many different elements of health. There's a physical health, and I'm not saying these are separate, but there's also sort of psychological health, well-being, if you want to say. That's such a broad question. I mean, I think that the question of health is your body and mind in a place that you can pursue a life with an underlying sense of joy and meaning. Now, that doesn't mean you're always joyful or always happy and you're not sad and you're not filled with grief or something. But if you have sort of a comprehensive sense of able to move about the world physically, okay, and not sort of impaired by pain, uh, you know, uh, whatever it might be that might limit you physically, then you're really blessed with this type of physical health. And then I think if you're a person who has sort of social engagements that you find meaningful, you have pursuits that you find meaningful, wherever they might be, they can be in very many different things, then you're in a healthy sort of social place. And that makes for a healthy mental place. So, and obviously there's degrees of this, but so for my definition of health is this combination of you have the blessing to move through life relatively pain free. We always have our pains, relatively free of illnesses that knock you down, and that you have this social world that is meaningful for you and rewarding to you, even as it can be difficult, frustrating, saddening, all those sort of things. But nevertheless, you're engaged in a way of being that is meaningful and in some ways socially rewarding to you. And when I say socially rewarding, you can be angry with people, you can be upset with people, you can be fighting with people, but nevertheless, you're engaged with people. You're not socially isolated and that sort of thing. So that's my sort of off the cuff sense of health. It's a good question, but it's you could spend months in books discussing what is health, and people try to do so.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I had a similar answer almost when I was on a guest on another episode. They hit me with that question, and yeah, to just be able to pursue your goals and aspirations without being inhibited by physical or mental or spiritual factor, right? I think you were getting
And
at that a
and
little bit.
also we should add that having some social some I don't want to. It is more difficult if you're really poor. Okay, so if you're really poor, it does often exact a toll on your health, obviously. So part of I think of when we think of social health is having at least a place to live, access to food, and that sort of thing. Um, but I don't want to say that there are poor people who aren't healthy. There's plenty of poor people who aren't healthy if they're living in certain situations. But having sort of material factors that allow you to pursue these things you're talking about is important to health as well, I think. And that's how a society nurtures well-being is they provide they try to provide people with these basic necessities so then people can flourish in these ways.
Oh, I mean, I completely agree. I think that's a really good point as well. And in today's society too, we kind of equate time and money, right? Because if you have to work two jobs, then it comes with a lot of stress, and financial stress is a very real thing that so many people face, especially in this day and age. So I think that's a very valuable point that you add. you know, I think that was fantastic. We may as well get into the meat and potatoes of the conversation.
Okay.
I want to discuss, what you're most known for. You've written some really amazing books, The Anatomy of an Epidemic and Mad in America. And these two pieces of literature, I think, are foundational. Maybe I could give you the floor to maybe just discuss a little bit about writing of these books, how you kind of came to this point, and we can take it from there.
Sure. I'll try to do this quickly so I don't take too long. So I think the important thing is because there's a process to talk about, a mental process, a journey to talk about. So, I was a medical reporter for a long time for newspapers. And then I did have a stint as director of publications at Harvard Medical School, this was at a time in the 90s they were talking about evidence-based medicine, the need to adopt evidence-based medicine, which when you even talk about the need, there's an understanding sense that doctors can be deluded about their merits of their therapy. So that's part of my background. Now, in the 1990s, I had a completely conventional understanding of psychiatry, okay, from being a reporter, a medical reporter. And the story that was being told to us reporters and then to the public at large was that psychiatry had made breakthrough advances in diagnosing and treating mental disorders. They had found that there were these chemicals, neurotransmitters, that were the cause of psychiatric disorders. So we were told that depression was due to too little serotonin, schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders due to too much dopamine. Now, that alone is a story of a great breakthrough. Think about that, how complex the brain is. And we were being told they could pick out a molecule that caused depression. They could pick out a molecule that caused schizophrenia or madness. Well, even that is a story of great advance. Like, wow. And I can remember the 1990s thinking in incorporating this into my sense of philosophy. So, am I just a robot driven by my neurotransmitters? In other words, it's just something that happens genetically, chemically, and almost apart from the environment, which, by the way, didn't fit with my experience at all. But anyway, and that was only part of the story. The second part of the story was that they now had drugs that could fix those chemical imbalances, like insulin for diabetes. Now, if that story were true, and by the way, I reported on that story as if it were true, okay, that it were as a documented truth, that would be the greatest advance in medical history, in my opinion, given the complexity of the brain, that they could identify these chemicals and fix them. That'd be the greatest advance in medical history. And by the way, in the 1990s, this story was being promoted in the sense that, oh my God, psychiatrists are gaining such powers, they can give you whatever personality you want. You want to be outgoing? We'll make you outgoing. And there was even some hand wringing over like, oh my God, do we really want a society where people are happy all the time? That's how the story that was being told to us. Now, what happened was in 1998, I was co-writing a series for the Boston Globe on abuses of patients in psychiatric research settings, okay? And one of the frameworks for that story was we looked at research studies where they had withdrawn antipsychotics from schizophrenia patients to see if they relapsed. And we said, that's unethical. You would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic to see what happened to them. So why would you withdraw an antipsychotic, which fixes a dopamine imbalance, like insulin for diabetes, to see if they become sick again? However, during that reporting, and then, by the way, I was rewarded for highlighting abuses of psychiatric research, but it was really within a common conventional context. That series was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Now, the reason I mention this is if you become a finalist for the Pulitzer and for public service, which is the top Pulitzer Prize, you're going to have an implicit bias to support what you reported on. Okay, you're going to your cognitive dissonance is going to say, "I'm not going to challenge this." Unfortunately, as that series was coming to print, I began questioning that chemical imbalance story. And here's why, and that whole story that antipsychotics represented a great advance in care. Okay. And that's part of the conventional myth is that antipsychotics arrive in asylum medicine in 1955 and it kicks off this great psychopharmacological revolution. And here's where the studies that made me question this. One, Harvard researchers in 1994 had looked at long term recovery rates for schizophrenia patients going back to the first third of the 20th century. And here's what they found: recovery rates for schizophrenia patients today were no better than in the first third of the 20th century, which belied that narrative of progress. And second of all, they had actually declined since 1975. They were in decline. So all of a sudden, we have very well known researchers looking at recovery rates over time, and that belies that story of progress. Okay, so that was the first that made me question. Second, there were these studies done by the World Health Organization, two studies, one 2 years in length and one 5 years in length, in which they compared outcomes in three developing countries, India, Nigeria, and Colombia, with outcomes in the US and six other developed countries. Okay. Now, as you know, we're in Western societies and in the US, we're very proud of our medicine. Okay. It's one of the things that we think is we're a global leader in medical advances. Well, what they found, and the first one was the 5 year study, is that outcomes were much, much better in the developing countries. So much so, the World Health Organization investigators concluded that living in a developed country is, quote, a strong predictor that you won't fully recover if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia. And by the way, the diagnosis was made by Western doctors in these other countries as well. So it wasn't a matter of diagnostic differential.
Sure.
Well, that was a stunner. Okay. Why would living in a developed country where you have these medicines that fix chemical imbalances be a predictor you'll do poorly? So in the second study, they looked at medication usage, the World Health Organization investigators. And the hypothesis for doing so was that, oh, maybe in the poor countries or the developing countries, the patients are more medication compliant. And that's why they have the better long-term outcomes. Now, that's a valid hypothesis. If the drugs indeed fix a known pathology, then compliance should theoretically lead to better long-term outcomes. So they measured outcomes, they measured medication use, and here's what they found in the second study. In the poor countries, India, Nigeria, and Colombia, and this was particularly true in India and Nigeria, where the outcomes were the best, they used the drugs acutely. A person has a psychotic episode, they used them to sort of stabilize them, but they didn't use the drugs chronically. Only something like 10% of the patients were maintained on the drugs in India and Nigeria. And in Colombia, it was 16%. But very few patients were maintained long term on antipsychotics. Now, what is the standard of care and what we're told in the United States? That you have to be maintained on antipsychotics, right? And otherwise, you're going to relapse and have a very horrible outcome. So that belied that common wisdom, okay? So then at this point, I called up a man named David Oakes, who had once been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and by the way, and he led something called Mind Freedom. He was off antipsychotics. And I said, what do you make of this? And he said, well, we hate these drugs. They make us feel like zombies. They make us less functional. And then he said this, you should dig into the research on brain volumes related to antipsychotics, because you're going to see that they shrink the brain. I said, what are you talking about? Anyway,
Amazing.
this is where the moment I said, I'm going to see what's really in the scientific literature. Okay. Because there's something amiss here with what I believed and have been reporting on. And so I got a contract to write Mad in America. And really, the purpose of the contract was to say, why are outcomes so poor in the United States and other developed countries? And what do we know about the long term impact of antipsychotics? Okay. And that led to a book in which basically I went back to colonial times, and you see that there's always a split between, by and large, between what the treaters are saying about the mad people and what the mad and their treatments and what the mad people are saying about the treatments. And the one thing you find is often if treatments quiet people, still people, make them less engaged, that's seen as a benefit by the providers, but not a benefit for those who are being so treated. And then there is this moment in history in the early 1800s when Quakers' ideas became prominent in sort of asylums. In fact, they led to a lot of the founding of asylums. And Quaker ideas were very different. And here's the key. They said, we don't know what causes madness, but we do know these people are brethren. And as brethren, we know they may have a God-given capacity to regain their reason and sanity. But even if not, we need to um, provide them with comfort. So we built these sort of asylums out in asylum meaning a refuge out in the country, and they exercised. They believed in exercise, diet, kindness, meaning in life. In other words, they believed in environments. Now, other historians have gone back, looked at their records, and said those are the best outcomes we've ever seen. And if you look at the case reports for when they came into the asylums, these were severely disturbed people. So now we had a thought from the early 1800s that says maybe environmental care is good. And then to finish the Mad in America story really quickly is what you find with the antipsychotics once they're introduced is a story of science that belies the story of how they're improving long-term outcomes. You find that very early on, it looks like they're induced, maybe people are getting better faster, but they're relapsing more frequently. Then there's studies done in the 1970s in which they do long-term outcomes, and in every case, there were better long-term outcomes if people got off the medications with the group as a whole. Then there was a biological explanation for why the drugs increased the risk of relapse. And then we can go forward from them for the last 40 years, and all this picture comes together that on the whole, antipsychotics used conventionally as a mandatory treatment long term for everybody worsens long term outcomes. And we can get into that. There's all sorts of research that confirms that worry that arose in the early 1980s. So that's Mad in America. But here's the thing the big picture is. So I went from believing in the conventional narrative to believing what we call a counter narrative. And the counter narrative put forth in Mad in America exists in the conventional psychiatric literature. You just have to dig it out. Okay. So then after that, I wrote a couple other books. My agent said, this is too, psychiatry is too controversial. You're going to ruin your life as a writer. I wrote a couple other books. But then people kept asking me, okay, but what's happening to the kids? Why are we having so many kids get diagnosed and seen as mentally ill? What's happening with why are we seeing more people with mood disorders? What's happening to these people long term? So, Anatomy of an Epidemic was conceived of in this way. First, I just looked at data showing the rising burden of mental illness in the United States, okay? And the rising treatment of people with diagnosing and treatment. Now, normally, if you diagnose diseases, because that's how they were presented to us, diseases of the brain, and you treat that with effective drugs, the burdens of those illnesses will diminish in society, okay? So that was the framework. And then what I really sought to do was just look at what does research tell us about the long-term impact of psychiatric drugs on these major disorders, schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, ADHD, that sort of thing. And that's a question that just so you understand the context of that question. In order to understand the impact of a treatment, you first need to sort of flesh out what is the natural course of that disease. So let's say the natural course of a disease is 50% are recovered in a year, and 30% stay the same and only 20% worsen. Well, you have to, in order for your treatment to be helpful, you have to beat that 50% rate, okay? You have to beat that spectrum of outcomes. So you can't just say, oh, listen, 20% of our people are just well in at the end of the year on this treatment. But you have to know the natural course. So the first thing I did in that book for each of these disorders was flesh out the natural course. And what you find there, by the way, is it's very actually reassuring or optimistic because you can find that so often people can have a time or an episode of depression, an episode even of psychosis, that sort of thing. But so much of these disorders are episodic, including by what we call bipolar, but manic depressive illness, meaning many people naturally recover over the long term. So you have that as your foil, and then unfortunately, what you see again and again is this pattern is when the drugs are introduced, doctors start saying, well, let's say with schizophrenia or with a depression, my patients do seem to be getting better faster, but now they're relapsing more frequently. And then when you put together this whole puzzle in Anatomy of an Epidemic, you see over and over again that in the aggregate, you're lowering recovery rates and increasing the risk of functional impairment. Now, what I think sometimes gets hard to understand is that doesn't mean everybody does poorly on the drugs. It means on the whole, you're worsening long term outcomes. So that was that book,
Mhm.
and then I did co-write another book called Psychiatry and the Influence that basically looked at why don't we know this story, and that was part of Anatomy of an Epidemic too. This expanded on it. We did it in this context of institutional corruption, and what you see in essence is that psychiatry going back to 1980 decided for guild purposes to tell a story of how these were diseases of the brain, but there weren't scientific discoveries to support that marketing story, that rebranding of psychiatry. Pharmaceutical companies love that story. They gave money to psychiatry to tell that story. And so the bottom line is, boy, this was a long winded answer. The bottom line is what you see in Anatomy of an Epidemic is that we as a society have organized our thinking and our care around a false narrative of science. In other words, the chemical imbalance story is a narrative of science, but it's not. And of course, what I write about in all of these books is that narrative, that hypothesis, which arose in the 1960s, fell apart. It wasn't found to be so. So that's the big picture of these books, and I think you call them a foundation. What they are is in my humble opinion, they're a sci- they're a research based, they're an evidence based story about how we organized ourselves around a false narrative of science, and that it is doing harm to us as a society as a whole.
Mhm. Very well put. Well, thank you for that. So, of course, we've spoken about the biological origins of mental illnesses before on this podcast, and um, we've discussed the flaws. So I don't think we need to get into that too much. But I am very curious about maybe hearing your thoughts on the environmental influence. You said that the environment has great impacts on recovery. Perhaps there is an environmental origin to it as well, right? Like through maybe traumatic experience. I don't know how you would sort of describe it. I don't know if you have a solid base of evidence
Sure.
for this either. I'd just like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think there is evidence for it. I just want to say one thing about biological causes of mental illness. The chemical imbalance story is was found not to be didn't pan out. That hypothesis didn't pan out. And we haven't found any characteristic sort of pathology for any diagnosis. But that doesn't mean there aren't obvious biological pathways to what we call it psychosis or depression, et cetera. So cardiovascular problems can lend themselves to depression. Syphilis, in-stage syphilis leads to psychosis. Parkinson's disease is often leads to psychosis. Toxins can lead to psychosis. So there, and we do know that there can be if you, very poor diet can lead to sort of depression and that sort of thing. So when we say we are biological creatures, now what I'm saying, we're brain body machines, okay? So if something has gone wrong with that machine, it can manifest in sort of mental difficulties. But
Mhm.
the point of that is there can be many pathways to depression. There can be many pathways to psychosis, and one of the problems is seeing this as a discrete disorder with a single pathway. So I just want to get that in there because one of the problems
Thank
with
you.
modern psychiatrists, they stopped looking for things like pernicious anemia was known to be it's a blood problem and that sort of thing that led to a lot of people being in asylums. And then once they got a treatment for pernicious anemia and discovered it and treated it, you understood that was a disease, not like just the symptoms were secondary to the disease. Now let's go back to the question of environments. And there's two parts to this. And I'll ask you a question: are you responsive to your environment?
Absolutely.
Right? What do you know growing up is that environments are so key. Do you have friends? Start with a kid. Is a kid in a safe environment? Do they have
Mm,
parents around that make them feel safe? That sort of thing. Do they have parents that are able to be around because they're not having to work 16 hours a day? So, and then what is their neighborhood like? Is their neighborhood safe? Okay. And then as we grow up, is like, have we found friendships? Have we found meaningful things to do? And at every stage in your life, I think you can look and say, like, what is happening in my environment and how is that affecting me? And by the way, of course, we know that, like, when you're a teenager, you're half crazy and, you're up and down like this and you're filled with angst and jealousies and urges, etc. That's part of it, and being alive too, is that we go up and down and we're very emotional creatures. But everything I know is that, if you have a hard time, you lose a job. Boy, that's tough when you lose a job. You start doubting yourself, How am I ever going to get a job? So we do everything that tells us is that environment matters. And by the way, if you look at evolutionary and our brains, what do our brains do? They change in response to the environment. They mold themselves in response to the environment. So we are creatures meant to be responsive to our environment. Now, if you go back and look at environmental cures, the Quakers are the most example. We don't know what causes insanity, but we do know they're brethren, so we're going to conceive of them like us, you know. And
Yeah.
then what worked? Well, what worked was being with other people, wanting to please other people, having a chance to read. And by the way, they would dress up neatly. They would have dances. They would exercise. In the 1800s, by the way, they played baseball at some asylums, and sometimes those traveling baseball teams were quite good. Okay, so and we see that that has always proven. So that's in the 1800s. It proved to help many people get well and stay well. That's what the research shows. But there are modern studies too. There's something called the Soteria Project that shows that with newly psychotic patients, if you put them in a residence with other people, where they cook with other people and can be with other people and can start thinking about how they might get their lives back, that's more successful than just drugs. The best outcomes we have in modern time in with psychotic patients, schizophrenic patients, comes from northern Finland, where they reconceptualize things. They said psychosis doesn't happen inside in the brain, it happens in the in-between spaces. We got to fix those in-between spaces. And part of that is helping the person remember when they could be with others and have an idea how they can move forward and rejoin society. That's an environmental form of care with dialogical therapy at the heart of it. And then if you see kids, like let's say kids who are, there's a place called what was the name of the place? Anyway, there was this place across from San Francisco that has long treated the worst kids. By the worst kids, I mean the most disturbed kids in California. They're called level 12 plus plus kids. And when they come in, they've all been diagnosed with schizophrenia. These are 5-year olds, 6-year olds, seven, or bipolar. Okay. And they're all on like 5, 6, 7 drugs. Okay. And they're acting out. They're difficult to reach and all. Well, the man who for many years was the psychiatrist there, he spent 12 hours fleshing out a biography of their lives and their parents' lives. In other words, he's asking what happened to them. And over again, of course, he sees these kids have been abused, they've been abandoned, they've been brutalized, they're not safe spaces. And then his thought was, how can we help people, these kids, build a new life? And he says, there's only way. You've got to model your behavior on somebody you love, okay, and care for, and somebody who cares for you. So what he always did was take everybody off the medications because the medications weren't solving what happened to them. And then they would mentor up with someone, and these were generally, poor kids, etc. So with someone like a younger person that they could see like as an older brother or something, okay, sort of from the same sort of milieu of the ethnic milieu, etc. And here's what he found: when the kids came off the drugs, they could now be emotional towards others. But at the same time, the others, the mentors, could now be emotional towards them because emotion is a two-way street. And if they're not getting anything bad, they can't do it. And what generally happened over time was initially as the kids, because they had interpreted in their interior, they had said, "Oh, I'm a bad kid. I'm an awful kid." All right. And now, because that was their self-identity, when they're taken off the drugs, they said, "You watch, I'll show you I'm a bad kid." So they would act out for about a month. And then you would see all these behavioral disturbances. And then they would start changing. And the change really happened when that bond formed, when that emotional bond formed. And next thing you know, they wanted to behave in a way that you know, fostered this sense of love and affection. Now, I spent a couple of days there. I'll tell you a real quick story.
Yeah, please.
First of all, you know, these horrible kids, I'm using those in quotes, had just come back from a trip to Disneyland because those who had been there longer, because they had learned to control their behaviors, that sort of thing. But when I went there, now that doesn't mean that everything was great. Okay, we're talking about severely disturbed kids, no hospital wanted and no foster care, but they were making this progress, and those at this further along could go to Disneyland. Well, the minute I got there, my first name's Bob. Okay, for some reason they started calling me Bob Marley. Okay. So everywhere I went on the campus, kids would shout out, "Hey, there goes Bob Marley." And it was affectionate. Okay. And, you know, I played games with them that we managed to going to McDonald's and this sort of thing. And I'd place an order with them. They'd run off. They'd come back with the fake hamburgers. And then when I was getting ready to leave on the second or third day, they all gathered around like that in this particular house where I had spent most of my time. And I went, going, what? But you see, they were anticipating something. So this little girl reaches out her hand to shake my hand goodbye. So I shake her hand goodbye. And what she had is one of those buzzers, you know, one of those buzzers that you have that stings you. So it stings me. Everybody burst out laughing. Okay. But that was a way to show affection towards me. Right. And it
Absolutely.
showed a totally different. So I didn't see these kids as schizophrenic. I didn't see them as bad. I just saw them as kids, and this is really interesting too. Once the presiding psychiatrist built this story, this life story, no one saw these kids now through that lens of diagnosis. They didn't see them as bipolar. They didn't see them as schizophrenia. They saw kids that had been abused and had no safe space. So go back to the Quakers. In essence, they're seeing them like brethren, and that's the change. Anyway, I could go on and on and on. I know a group that what they did with ADHD kids, they taught them how to cook, and they talked to them about diets. They incorporated exercise into this. They introduced that into a school, and guess what happened? Those kids started changing as well. So, and are you surprised by this? I'm asking. Are you surprised that environment can help kids?
I'm like not surprised whatsoever.
Yeah. Can I give one last story? There's this group in
Please,
Connecticut.
no, please
No, I
continue.
know. This is so important. I think there's this group in Connecticut called Volunteers for Psychotherapy, and what they do is when people come out of a mental hospital, mostly they're working with people who've been hospitalized. And often they're very poor. Okay, they can't afford psychotherapy. So this group says we'll give you free psychotherapy. In a way, it's free. You have to pay for it by volunteering 2 hours per week. You can volunteer in an animal shelter. You can volunteer taking meals to elderly people. Now, what happens when someone volunteers? They're no longer the sick one. They're not the one that you know is seen as the abnormal one. Now, what's their new role? They're helping others. And if they go to a social situation, what do? They don't have to say, "Well, I sit around because I'm bipolar and depressed." They can say, "Oh, you know, I work with the elderly. I work in an animal shelter." So that changes their sense of self. So what have they done with that volunteer? And you know, the guy who runs this every once in a while joke like, I don't know if the psychotherapy is any help, but I'm pretty sure the volunteer work is. That's an example of changing the person's environment.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm really glad you shared that. I think that's extremely valuable. And I think you're really hitting the nail on the head here, of course. But one of the books that got me into this way of thinking was How to Become a Schizophrenic by John Modrow, I believe.
Oh yeah, that's a great
And he
book.
told a fantastic book, and he told the story of his life and you know, a huge part of it, of his theory of how he developed schizophrenia, was being treated like he was some psychotic person. He was treated as this psychotic person or this bad person, so he would act out. And you mentioned there, the kids for a month after getting off the psychiatric drugs, they would start acting as bad kids. I'm going to show you how bad I really am. I think that is just foundational to this whole problem is people are over identifying with these disorders that are being put onto them like, oh, I'm an ADHD person, I can't focus. And then you'll never be able to focus, right? Like, and it's and it comes down a lot to the diagnosing. You know, we could take this so many different directions. Maybe I could just get a word from you on the diagnosis and maybe the role that plays. And how are we formulating these diagnoses in the first place? How are we
Sure.
categorizing them? Because the
Can I make
DSM,
one quick
has
comment
had a
on
lot of
John
criticism.
Monroe's book? I thought that was a
Please,
great book.
yeah, no, no,
Two things in there. If you remember, he has towards the end, he has this line. If you want to know how to help, and he used the word schizophrenics, you want to know how to help schizophrenics? Stop the lies. That's what he said. Stop the lies about us.
yeah,
So that was powerful. Now, there's also what you're talking about, how you're treated. Like one of the things, if you go back to some of the work in the 1960s, they talk about, and 70s, the staff, when someone got labeled as schizophrenic, uh, they would never, you could ask them, like, if the patient could ask what time it is, they wouldn't respond. They wouldn't look them in the eye. They basically just ignored them as worthless all the time. It's not worthy of paying attention to. Well, that could drive you a little nuts. Go around the world and have people not look you in the eye ever, and you ask them about times ignoring you, walking by you. That'll make you a little psychotic. And there's a famous
100%.
guy named Sanborn Bachhoven who said something about people with schizophrenia as being extremely sensitive to the slings and arrows of misfortune. And then he said is most of these things can be episodic unless we do something to turn them chronic. And one of the things is we now have a diagnostic system that says it's a chronic disease. That's the new message to them. Beyond, and then of course people are treated as if they have a chronic thing, as if it is their condition, okay, that they move through the world as chronically ill. So here's the diagnosis in some way is the story that was told about the diagnoses
Yeah,
is part of the root problem. And maybe it is the root to the problem. Because what happens with the diagnostic scheme we have that we've organized ourselves around came with the publication of DSM-3 in 1980. Now, and the story that was told when it was announced is we are now conceiving of these things as diseases of the brain with discrete causes, and they're real illnesses just like cardiovascular diseases, cancer, and schizophrenia is as different from bipolar as cancer is from heart disease. And there's specific causes. Then we hear about the chemical imbalances. So that was validating this disease brain. The idea that mental disorders were psychiatric disorders were diseases of the brain. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, basically psychiatry with funding from pharma ran PR camps to say depression is a disease. It's not basically what happened to you or anything like that or moral failure. It's a disease of the brains. And ADHD was saying if you don't believe in ADHD as something real, then you're like a flat earth person. That's how they sold it. Okay. Okay. So they're telling a story that these diagnostic categories have been validated as real diseases of the brain. Validation is the key here, and we'll go into that in a second. And that if you don't believe this science, you're a flat earther. Okay, that's what we were told. Now, if they're diseases of the brain, that does mean it's chronic, right? If it's a chemical imbalance, okay, and it means I'm going to need this drug and it's going to become part of my identity. This is what happens in my brain. There's this abnormality, okay? Now, here's the tragedy of this. It's all, can I cuss here for a second? It's all
yeah. Go
bullshit.
ahead.
It's all bullshit scientifically. Because here's the roots of DSM-3. In the 1970s, psychiatry was feeling under siege as a medical discipline, and there were various reasons it was feeling under siege. One was there was an anti-psychiatry movement that came out of academia. That's Foucault and Irving Goffman and Thomas Szasz, who said that psychiatry functions not so much as a medical discipline, but as a social control, uh, uh, social control discipline. That's number one. Then number two, we had the first real popular drug were the benzodiazepines, Librium and Valium, okay? And they became real popular in the 60s, and women like crazy were put on the drugs. The marketing of these drugs is hilarious, by the way. Basically, if you see the marketing, it's like, is your wife a bitch? Have her take Valium. That's really the marketing, etc. And then they would show the woman bringing him the man the slippers and a drink when he came home from work.
And
But anyway,
yeah,
in the
yeah.
1970s, it became known that these were addictive, and both in the UK and the US, there were government panels at the highest echelons of government saying these drugs are addictive and they're drugs of abuse. And so all of a sudden, Valium's seen rather than as this great drug for alleviating anxiety as a problem drug, even compared to heroin. Okay, so their basic drug went to be seen as problematic. Next, you had people, ex-hospital patients, forming a psychiatric survivor movement, which was a model after the civil rights movement, and saying, hugs, not drugs, and they called themselves survivors of psychiatry. So the patients were saying they were rebelling against the doctors. Okay, then we had all sorts of competition for psychiatrists. We had mental health counselors, right? We had psychologists, everybody offering talk therapy, and they couldn't prove that their talk therapy was any better than this other talk therapy. And then there were two things that really made psychiatry say we have to rebrand ourselves. One was the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but basically it's set in an asylum, and the real crazy people are the staff. Okay. And the people with wisdom and knowledge and reason really are often seen as the patients. Okay. And then also there was a famous study done by David Rosenhan, a psychologist at Stanford, where he and 7 of his students presented themselves at mental hospitals, and they said they were hearing a word called thud. That was it. They were all admitted, and they were all seen as diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then once they were in the hospital, at least this was what was reported at the time, none of the staff ever identified them as imposters, but the other patients did. Anyway, this came out. It was published in Science. And a week later, the American Psychiatric Association said, we've got to change our image. So the image of psychiatrists was sort of as crazy people with people on the couch. And they said, what do we need to do? We need to put on a white coat. We need to present ourselves as doctors, like infectious disease doctors who treated real diseases of the brain. So now their whole goal here was to resell themselves as treating diseases of the brain. But there was no discovery behind that sense that they have found the pathology of these major disorders. The chemical imbalance hypothesis was being floated. That gives it a little, push as well. But there was no concrete founding. And the other thing was, it was known that psychiatric diagnoses with DSM-1 and DSM-2 were neither reliable nor valid. Reliability means you went to 2 different doctors, you got 2 different diagnoses, and they weren't validated as real diseases.
Hmm.
Now, when DSM-3 is created, and they somehow find 200. You know why there's 267 disorders in DSM-3? Because they said we need a diagnosis for everybody who comes to us for whatever reason, so we can get insurance reimbursement. Okay, so basically, you got a problem, you're in the DSM. It doesn't matter what it is; they can diagnose you. Okay. But when they published this book, they acknowledged these were not validated as real diseases. And the way you validate diseases, you find a genetic link. You find that this thing is responsive only to this type of drug and not to another type of drug. You flesh out the long-term course of the disorder, that sort of thing. You find the pathology. And the thought was they would, through research on the brain, validate these disorders, okay, as real disorders. Now, in 1984, Nancy Andreasen, the future um, editor in chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry, she writes a book, becomes a bestseller called The Broken Brain. And now she presents this, that these are real diseases, discrete diseases. Now, and so that becomes a story that we have, the people who have these problems have broken brains, okay? That's not an environmental thing. There's something abnormal in the brain. Now, what you don't know about in that book, she says, these are just hypotheses. And we actually haven't found the research to confirm it. However, we think the answer is in the chemical imbalance story, okay? So then what happened? The chemical imbalance story is presented, okay? And that confirms this for the public as validated disorders. And you can see in 1987, They did a survey about people about depression, and they asked people, why do you get depressed? Why do people get depressed? Oh, bad things happen to people. What's the course of depression? Well, over time, it'll pass. You can live through it. It's episodic. At that point, the American Psychiatric Association said, we need to write, and they got paid by the pharmaceutical companies, we need to say it's a disease of the brain. And you need to basically, and it's due to chemical imbalances, and you need to take these drugs. And by 2005, they did a survey and they said, yeah, that's people now understand that depression is caused by low serotonin. But here's the problem.
Hmm.
When they began looking into the low serotonin theory, in other words, now they start studying people before they go on antidepressants, they don't find that the people have low serotonin as a matter of course before they go on. And the first time is 1983. The NIMH says, we're just not finding this. By 1999, so they've done another 16 years of experiments in all sorts of ways to measure low serotonin. The APA's, American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said this hypothesis didn't pan out. And they said it was born from an understanding of how the drugs act on the brain, because antidepressants increase the availability of monoamine, serotonin's monoamine in that synaptic gap. In other words, they up that activity. So the hypothesis was born based on that understanding of the drug action. Okay, maybe depression is due to too little serotonin. And in 1999, the APA said, this is sort of a silly hypothesis to begin with because there's no reason that the pathology of the disorder is going to be the opposite of a drug that treats some symptoms. So it was declared dead in 1999 by the APA. 2 years later, the head of the APA is writing a magazine article saying that we now know that depression is a real disease. We now know that. And in 2005, the APA put out a thing saying the public needs to understand that psychiatrists are doctors who fix chemical imbalances in the brain. All this was nonsense. So here's the problem, Leaf, that you're going at. And by the way, we could go into the dopamine hyperactivity thing, but basically the whole chemical imbalance theory fell apart. And my favorite quote on this is in 2004, Kenneth Kendler, who's a real big guy in the world of psychology and psychiatry, he investigated. He says, we have looked for big, simple neurochemical explanations for major psychiatric disorders, and we have not found them. That's in the research literature. And then a guy named Ronald Pies in 2012, editor-in-chief at that time of Psychiatric Times, says, the chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders was always a kind of urban myth, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. And in a way, it is true. Well-informed psychiatrists didn't believe it, and it fell apart in the 80s. But that wasn't communicated to the public. So go back to diagnosis. Here is the betrayal of the public. And this was done first in the United States, but around the world. And we can talk about ADHD in a second. They told us you have a broken brain if you're depressed. They told you you had low serotonin. They told you that's why you needed to take antidepressants for life, that it was a necessary treatment. And what did the research really show? You didn't have a chemical imbalance. That's number one. Actually, the drugs were only antidepressants were only minimally effective over the short term. And there was increasing evidence by the 90s that you find in the research literature, people are saying, do these drugs increase the chronicity of depression? All that's in the research literature, that it's not validated, that these drugs don't fix a chemical imbalance, and that outcomes seem to be worsening over the long term. And there was a key paper by a guy named Stephen Hyman in 1996. He was the director of the NIMH at this time. So he's the head of the National Institute of Mental Health. He writes a paper called A Paradigm for Understanding Psychotropic Drugs. And here's what he says. These drugs perturb the normal functioning of the brain. In other words, antipsychotics block dopamine receptors, SSRIs block the normal reuptake. In response to this perturbation, the brain goes through a series of compensatory adaptations because we have all these feedback loops, and what research says, it's trying to maintain a homeostatic equilibrium. It's trying to maintain the normal functioning of this pathway. So, for example, you go on an antipsychotic, which blocks dopamine receptors, your brain sprouts new dopamine receptors. So this was found in the early 80s. The irony is antipsychotics induce the very abnormality in the brain hypothesized to cause schizophrenia in the first place. Same thing with depression. Antidepressants. So antidepressants up serotonergic activity. So your brain says, uh-oh, I got to diminish my own serotonergic physiology in order to bring it back into balance. So I'll put out less serotonin, at least for a time, and I'll reduce the density of my serotonergic receptors. So the drugs induce the opposite physiology of what the drug's intending to do. And there's a paper, they call this oppositional tolerance. There's a paper, you can read papers saying this is the reason for the poor long-term outcomes. Was that ever told to the public? Did we ever hear about oppositional tolerance? Did we ever hear about drugs that perturb normal functioning and that we hadn't found that there was anything amiss, any characteristic pathology? That's what I mean. We were told of a story of a great narrative advance when the research told us of disorders that hadn't been validated, okay, by chemical imbalances, drugs that actually induced abnormalities, and poor long term outcomes. And by the way, away from this, you see people like Nancy Andreasen, Stephen Hyman saying, we have to confess none of these disorders were ever validated as distinct diseases. That's what they're saying beginning around 2000. That's what Nancy Andreasen said. That's what Stephen Hyman said. And there was a panel in 2012 when they gathered people together for they were doing DSM-5, and they said, have we validated any of the disorders? And this panel of uh, well-known psychiatrists involved in these constructing these diagnostic categories and said these are just constructs. They're not actually reflective of net diseases in nature. They have not been validated as real disorders. But that's not what the public is told either. We've been told they're validated.
Mm-hmm.
That's the betrayal.
Yeah,
Long-winded answer again.
yeah, yeah. Well, there just seems to be a major disconnect too, right, between, well, the literature, the curriculums as well, because they're people are being taught these principles in med school, and that this is the way. Biological psychiatry is the only way forward, and the literature is just not there to support it, and we see that far too often. You know, one of the problems that I see when I look at the literature is, and you mentioned oppositional tolerance, which is interesting. The effect that going on these drugs has on the course of healing or treatment curing these disorders, you know, I can't help but it might play a role in the literature as well, right? How many schizophrenics out there aren't on psychiatric medication or have never had psychiatric medication, right? Do you see that being a little problem with our studies now? Because it's almost an instant, you present to an emerge room or whatever it may be, and it's like, boom, you're on these drugs right away.
Absolutely. This is part of the blindness that has enveloped the profession and society. Here's an amazing statistic, okay, or fact that is admitted. Antipsychotics were introduced in 1955 into asylum medicine. It's now 2024. A few years ago, researchers at Columbia tried to see, do we know that these drugs are effective in first episode psychosis? In other words, when people haven't been previously medicated. And they said there's no evidence that we don't have evidence that that's so. And the Cochrane collaboration, which is a very famous collaboration for trying to review the literature and answer questions, they actually concluded, and I think this was in 2005, they concluded that if anything, it looked like even over the short term, first episode psychotic patients did better if they weren't medicated on the whole. So, what you have, and here's the delusion, and you're really absolutely right about this. And then I'll talk about one other study that's really key on this. But our evidence base is formed this way. You take people who are on antipsychotics, like most short term trials actually have been conducted in chronic patients. So now their brain is adjusted to the drug, right? Then you wash them out, you take everybody off, and after a couple of days, you put one group back on the drug that they've become accustomed to, and the other you keep off the drug. They're randomized to placebo. But that's not a placebo group that's reflecting the natural course of the disorder. That's a group going through drug withdrawal, and we know that drug withdrawal has all sorts of symptoms. But that's the evidence for short-term studies, okay? short-term use. And that's also the evidence for long-term use. So what you do with long-term use is you take people who have the group that has responded well. It's not even everybody. Take a group that is stabilized on the drugs, and one half is randomized to maintaining on the drug. They're not washed out at all. The other is washed out and put on placebo. Well, as a well-known person named, oh my God, why am I drawing a blank on him? He's from Tufts Medical School. Nasir Gami. Every once in a while, a name just disappears from me. He recently wrote his, those are not scientific studies, those relapse studies, because they'll always show that the group that has done well is going to continue to do better than those that are taken off the drug. Okay, it's a select group.
Hmm.
He says those are not scientific studies, and he says because of that, we have no evidence for using these drugs long term. Okay, but you're
Hmm.
right. We don't know about the natural course of first episode psychosis, right? Because everyone gets
Mhm.
medicated right away. Now, in the 70s, when people weren't being medicated so much just in the community, because now you get kids put on antipsychotics, all sorts of things. They did 3 studies that involved not putting people on antipsychotics right away. And in every instance, all NIMH funded, at the end of either one was 1 year in length, one was 2 years in length, and one was 3 years in length. On the whole, the group that wasn't immediately medicated had the better outcomes. And the group that had the best outcomes was the group that never went on medication. Okay. And what they found in the group that, in one study, a 3 year study that never went on medication, 2/3 were basically just recovered at the end of 3 years. Now you say, because and recovery means they're not on medications, they're working or back in school, that sort of thing, and they're not psychotic. Now, what was recovery rates from 1945 to 1955 for first episode patients before the drugs arrived? 3 to 5 years later, what percentage were living independently in the community? Take a guess. 67%, roughly, 70%. But we don't
Wow.
see that today because everyone is put on drugs right away. Now, we have a study that upset this apple cart, this belief, if it would have been promoted. Now, we promoted it in Anatomy of an Epidemic, and that was done by Martin Harrow and Thomas Jobe. Long-term outcome study. They take They enrolled 200 patients, some from a public hospital in Chicago, some from a private hospital. Now it's going to be a naturalistic study. Everybody's put on drugs in the hospital. They're discharged, and now they're just going to follow them at 2 years, 4.5, 7.5, 10, 15 years, and look at how they're doing. At each follow up, they're going to look at, are they taking medication? Are they psychotic? Are they anxious? What's their cognitive functioning and social functioning? And here's what they found: those who got off by year 2, even though when they got off they were psychotic, actually between year 2 and 4.5 they got much, much better, to where 40% were in recovery by the end of 4.5 years, and that group that stabilized at 4.5 years had almost no relapses. So long term, the recovery rate was 8 times higher for those off medication. They were much more likely to be working, had better cognitive function, less anxiety. Now here's the kicker to your question: they said the people who did well left care. They stopped going to psychiatrists. So psychiatrists only saw those who relapsed and came back to care. And he said, this is the clinician's delusion. They don't see the people who drop out and get well. They only see those who stop taking medication and relapse. And so they lack
Mhm.
this understanding of the capacity to recover. Now, one of the things that I will tell you is, like, I run this website called madinamerica.com. We have that because of this website and because of my chance to, like, be invited to talk to them. I know all sorts of people who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia and are fine now and off medication. But here's part of the kicker: if you've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, say when you're 22, and you have a time of psychosis, and then you leave care and you get better, do you start you tell people, oh yeah, I used to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia? You leave out that part of your biography. And by the way, Harrow and Job found people who became lawyers, teachers, professional jobs. None of those people said, "Oh yeah, I was in a hospital and diagnosed with schizophrenia." Nobody. So this is part of what your question goes to: do we know the natural course of these disorders? And by law, we don't. The antidepressant trials have the same sort of flaw in them. They're not in medication
Absolutely.
naive. There was, but there have been a couple efforts in the 80s and beyond to discover the natural course of depression. In one 6 year study, they said those who did not get treatment, even though they had the same problem at the beginning, were 7 times less likely to suffer a disruption of their functioning. And anyway, they had much better outcomes than the treated group, much and
Mm,
et cetera. And then there was another one where they looked at recovery rates at the end of 1 year for an untreated group, unmedicated group. Guess what it was for depression? 85%. And guess what it was before the introduction of antidepressants? 85%. And the researchers said, wow, it's going to be hard for any treatment to beat that natural course of recovery. And by the way, that's exactly what the mood disorders experts said in the 1970s, saying, like, depression is one of those things that gets better over time. Really, the only reason to use antidepressants is maybe we can speed up the healing. It's hard to beat this bottom line recovery rate. Anyway, long-term outcomes for depressed patients who are treated are it's not an 85% recovery rate. It's like much, much worse.
hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think centrally one of the main things, and something that you allude to quite often, is we're so intolerant to these people, right? And not to group them like that sort of way, but we're intolerant to mental illness in general as a society. And in general, I feel like, even yeah, I've heard interesting stories of people studying different indigenous groups, and somebody was termed schizophrenic because they it was a woman who killed a goat in the Hadza tribe, where only the men could kill goats. So, the psychiatrist that was there diagnosed her as schizophrenic because she went against, and she was portraying these it's all very cultural based. And but it's at the end of the day, people are intolerant to it. They're not, they don't want to be patient with their children with ADHD, and at the same time, I don't believe that every child can sit in a classroom for 8 hours and thrive. I don't think that means that there's anything wrong with the child. I think that it's probably a good indication that a child is healthy. They should be moving and active and engaged in something that's meaningful. But I just think that there's a huge intolerance to these conditions, right? Like,
Yeah. So 2 points to your point. Let's start with the ADHD thing. Yeah, kids are not meant to sit in a classroom for 7, 8 hours and then go home and do homework. That's just not how they're built. And this is part of the thing. If you change your classrooms to where you're out in nature, you're out running around, you're letting kids go out and play, and play without too much supervision, like
yeah,
parents hovering over you or teachers hovering over you. What do you find? Then when they come back to the classroom, they can stand it a little bit longer. And the other thing is, I'm an old guy, but when I was growing up into high school, if you didn't like school, there was basically trade routes.
yeah,
And when they went into things where they were taking a car, those who went that route, maybe they didn't like sitting in a classroom and doing grammar and stuff, but then they could go into an automobile repair shop and and
absolutely.
and become completely focused on taking apart an engine
Yeah,
or doing metal
100%.
work or doing carpentry work. So it's not that they had ADHD. What they did have is a way of being that didn't like the way our schools are organized. And you can go in any place and change those schools, and ADHD tends to disappear. And so that's the first thing. Okay, what is the environment where we're and just think about this. A lot of our work environments suck today for adults. You're sitting around a desk doing something you don't give a shit about. Sorry, you don't care about, right? And of course, it's just it's demoralizing and that sort of thing. And then maybe you have so there's a lot of demoralizing aspects to our society. So that's the first part of this, whether it be kids or how we have to live.
Absolutely.
But the other thing is when you say that there's not sort of a tolerance, what the problem is, this way of thinking that we have, it draws a line between the normal and the abnormal, as if
Sure.
there's a line. And it seems to say they're the other, okay? And you're either, that group is the other. And that sort of like raises a tribal instinct to say, yeah, we're the normal people and there's the other. And whenever you identify a group as the other, that lends itself to abuse and not listening to them and not seeing
Absolutely.
that they're worthwhile. And then you also talked about cultures. Well, there's great studies that show like black men, if you have to take the same behavior, okay, and they've done experiments where they give psychiatrists, and this goes back to the 80s, a list of, they don't actually see the patients. They say, here's the symptoms of the patient. Now, the only thing in these case report studies they'll change is it a black male, black female, white male, white female? Now, I'll ask you, who gets most likely diagnosed as schizophrenic after having schizophrenia? Which group of those four? Black male, black female, white female. Who's going to be
I think
diagnosed with schizophrenia?
I think black male.
Black male, of course. Now,
Yeah.
who's second most?
Second most, black female.
Yeah. Who's the
Must
third most back going to the 1980s?
must be white male.
No, white female.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
Because at this time, most of the psychiatrists in the 80s were
We're,
white
yeah.
males.
Sure.
So
Sure. Yeah.
females were more different than males. And then black
Interesting.
females, and then there was this whole thing about, black males with the whole sort of tropes around black males and stuff. So, uh, my point is, we have a diagnostic system that says these people are abnormal, and they're asked even to incorporate it into their way of thinking. And so we're actually being encouraged to think of them as different. And
Mhm.
here's the problem with this philosophy of being. How old are you, Leave?
24.
Okay. Are you the same as you were when you were 16?
Not even close.
Not even. How about when you were 12?
Yeah, same. Yeah, not even close.
Okay, you're not the same person. You change, of course. And I
Yeah,
guarantee you, unless you're a very unusual kid, you had some ups and downs. And I bet you fought with
100%.
your mind sometimes, like, what's going, like you're sort of trying to come grips with your mind. That's what it is to be born human, to be a human, is you actually have to struggle to come to grips with your mind and your emotions, which are so powerful. We're very powerful, we're very emotional creatures. We always say that the chimps are so emotional. Well, we're even more emotional than the chimps. But the problem is now we have this false philosophy of being, which says, like, oh, you have a depressed brain, you have an ADHD brain, you have a bipolar brain, you have a psychotic brain, and it's completely ahistorical. And all I would say is what we should really do: throw away the DSM, because the DSM presents the most impoverished philosophy of being in any book. And what you should do is go read your Greeks, go read your Romans, go look at Shakespeare, go read your novels, and go to the theater. And what do you see in novels, literature, religious tracts? Go read the Bible. Are these people nice and normal, and, like, not, do they have not have rages? Do they not have jealousies? So just, what does history tell us? It tells us that human beings are all over the map with their emotions, and they don't control them so easily, and they change all over the time. I'm 71. I'm not the same person I was when I was 61, 51, 41, 31, 21. Each time is different.
Yeah.
So much so that if I met myself in 21, I would probably start laughing. Like, who is this character? But this is
Yeah,
part of the problem when you say lack of tolerance, because it's built around a fake story that says
sure.
these people are abnormal. They're not like us. And anything that history tells us is, when you identify people as not like us, you abuse those people. You will do
Absolutely.
things to those people you won't do to yourself.
Absolutely. Very well put. Yeah. And on that note, I think we'll conclude with some final thoughts here. Anything that you think you might have missed or you want to add here? That was amazing, honestly. Honestly. Yeah.
Well, you sort of wound me up with your questions, and I just went on and on. So I'm sorry if I curtailed the back and forth, but your questions were great. And, the only thing is, like, you try to give people a sort of bigger picture of of what has happened, and what science may be saying, what the research may be saying, and how we ended up where we are. And there's sort of stories that help us understand that. So anyway, you got me going, and I went on a great length. So, but thanks for having me. I think what
Oh
you're
my
doing is
goodness.
really
No,
important here, is raising these questions for society, helping us think about what we know and we don't know and what we've been told.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't change a thing about this interview. I think it was perfect. Yeah, I it was amazing. No, I really appreciate your time. Maybe if you want to take a moment to tell a listener how they can learn more from you, support you. I got two of your books. I'll have to get the third there, and you have the great website. But anything else that you wanna
Well, I would
add?
just say that we do have a website, madinamerica.com. And there we have daily science reports. So you'll read all this science that isn't promoted to the public precisely because it counters conventional wisdom. We have people telling their lived stories, their stories about being identified as patients and what happened to them. And we have an art section. We have podcasts ourselves where we interview people. And then we also have a resource section. So you can go on the menu bar says drugs, and there's a drop down, and you can then go to like antidepressants, and there's a nice synopsis of what the research is related to their short-term efficacy, how they act on the brain, and long-term outcomes. And you'll see in that, and by the way, those resource pages have links to the studies, so you can go read the studies yourselves, and you can go educate. You can go see this counter narrative on Mad in America daily, but also in the resource pages. And in terms of how you can support us, we are a nonprofit. You can imagine that when you counter conventional wisdom, it's hard. You don't get grants, yeah, that sort of
Absolutely
thing.
not.
But so we're basically listener supported, and it costs $20 a year to gain full access to all our science reviews and our resource pages, which I think is, so you can come to our site, sign up as a yearly subscriber, and that's a great way to support us.
Awesome. Amazing. Mr. Whitaker, thank you so much again for coming on. This was amazing discussion.
Well, thanks for having me. Your questions were great, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, great. Okay, and I want to thank you all for listening. You should know that this is not medical or psychiatric advice. This is for your informational purposes only. But also remember, we're all responsible, sovereign beings capable of criticizing, thinking, and understanding absolutely anything. We, the people in the greater forest, are together self healers, self governable, self teachers, and so much more. Please reach out if you have any criticism, comments, concerns, whatever it may be. You know where to find me, Beyond Train on Instagram. Listen, I really appreciate every single one of you. If you found this informative in any way, you know how to support me, like, share, follow, comment, subscribe, review, whatever you got to do on the platform you're listening to. That's the best way to do it. There are a couple links there if you want to go further. But yeah, just remember there's two types of people in the world, those who believe they can, those who believe they can't, and they're both correct. All right, guys, thanks for listening. Take care.